It was October 14th, 1993, a Thursday marked by clouds swollen with rain and a hush over the town of Brookstone. At precisely 8:45 a.m., the yellow buses pulled up to the gates of Brookstone Zoo. Children clambered out with bright plastic ponchos crinkling in the wind and shoes splashing in small puddles that formed in the cracks of the lot. Among them was 5-year-old Lucy Bennett. Her backpack was sky blue with a fraying strap, and her red ribbon had already begun slipping from her braid. She held her laminated name tag like it was a passport to a world she could not wait to enter. Lucy's mother, Dana, had stood outside their apartment earlier that morning, watching the bus door fold open. She had waved until the bus turned the corner and disappeared from view. Then she had walked back inside alone. Her husband, David, had left for work hours earlier. Dana made tea and tried to occupy herself, but something felt off. Not dread, not quite, just a pressure in her chest that would not fade. She chalked it up to nerves. Lucy's first real trip without her. Back at the zoo, the children were corralled into groups. Miss Connolly, their teacher, kept a checklist and wore a whistle around her neck, though she never used it. The air was dense with the smell of wet bark, and the morning exhibits began with the flamingos. From there, they moved to the aviary, then the reptile house, and finally the highly anticipated primate wing. The rain had started just as the group reached the path near the orangutan enclosure, falling in a steady curtain. Miss Connolly made the call to head indoors. The primate house was the closest shelter. Inside, the space echoed with the sound of water dripping through a ventilation grate and the murmurs of restless children. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. Glass walls separated them from the enclosures, and most of the kids rushed toward the spider monkeys and howler exhibits. But Lucy lingered. She had always loved gorillas best. There was something solemn in their faces she found beautiful. She wandered toward the end of the hall where the lighting was dimmer and the crowd had thinned out. There, past an underlit plaque about silverbacks, was an old enclosure housing 2 aging gorillas named Mac and Simon. One was asleep curled against a fake rock. The other sat upright close to the glass. Lucy pressed her hands to the surface. The gorilla lifted its head slowly, blinking, then leaned forward until its breath fogged the same spot her fingers touched. She smiled, whispering something only the glass could hear. Then the lights flickered. It was brief. 1 second. Maybe less. A surge of electricity whined in the ceiling, followed by a crack of thunder so close it shook the window frames. Most of the children screamed. Miss Connolly shouted for them to stay together. No one noticed that Lucy was no longer by the gorilla exhibit. At least not right away. When the head count came up short, there was confusion first. A misplaced name tag. A child in the wrong group, but 10 minutes passed, then 20. The confusion soured into fear. Zoo staff sealed the front gates. A call was placed to 911. Parents were notified. Dana's phone rang at 12:07 p.m. She dropped the teacup she had just lifted, the sound of it shattering on the tile drowned out by the officer's steady, careful voice. When Dana arrived at the zoo, she was taken to a cordoned-off area by the primate wing. Officers had already begun searching the exhibit's storage sheds, bathrooms, and utility halls. She pushed past them. Mud splashed onto her jeans. The security guards didn't try to stop her. She found Miss Connolly sitting against a wall, her hands trembling. Her face was soaked from more than just the rain. Dana didn't stop. She walked along the paths Lucy had walked past, damp wooden signs and benches, still slick with morning dew. She called her daughter's name over and over, voice growing hoarse. That evening, just before sunset, a janitor discovered something strange behind the gorilla enclosure. A narrow service hallway had a metal door usually locked, but now slightly ajar. Inside the hallway, beneath a forgotten maintenance ladder, was Lucy's backpack. Damp, but not drenched. The juice box was intact. The notebook with crayon sketches of monkeys was still inside. But one thing was missing: the red ribbon. No other evidence was found. No footprints. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. And no surveillance footage. That was the part that caused the most confusion. The zoo's cameras had recorded every minute of the field trip except for the 21 minutes surrounding the time Lucy vanished. The tape had glitched, technicians said. Wiped itself clean due to a power surge. It was a fluke. 1 in a million. In the weeks that followed, the story made national news. A child vanishing in broad daylight at a zoo was too strange to ignore. Psychics offered visions. Tips came in from 3 states. None led anywhere. The gorilla exhibit was quietly closed and renovated. Zoo officials stopped commenting to the press. Dana and David appeared together on television, once holding a framed photo of Lucy in her first-grade uniform. After that, David stopped speaking publicly. Eventually, he stopped coming home altogether. Dana, however, did not stop. Each year on October 14th, she returned to Brookstone Zoo. She stood by the now-defunct entrance to the primate house, closed for budgetary reasons and labeled unsafe. She tied a new red ribbon to the fence each time, even as the weather turned and her hands stiffened from cold. Some years she was joined by a local reporter. Other years she was alone. Always she stood in silence. Always she looked toward the place where her daughter had last been seen. Then, in 2014, something happened. Travis Morgan, a young zookeeper doing inventory in a forgotten wing of the zoo, stumbled across a storage cage hidden behind overgrown ivy. The cage was old, the kind used during renovations or temporary quarantines. Its hinges were rusted, and it appeared untouched for decades. But the padlock was secured through the inside latch, not outside where someone would usually lock it. From inside. Someone somehow had locked themselves in. He called security. They called the police. And within an hour, Dana received a call of her own. For the first time in 21 years, someone had found something new, something hidden, something that should never have been locked that way. And that's where everything began to unravel. Again. The zoo, after dark, no longer resembled the cheerful place that once echoed with the laughter of children and the calls of exotic animals. It had grown older, more hollow, and less cared for as years passed, and exhibits closed one by one. The once vibrant murals had faded, and the snack bar windows were boarded shut. But tonight, beneath flickering exterior lights, a small convoy of police vehicles, zoo officials, and one tired mother approached the old maintenance corridor at the far end of the abandoned primate wing. The area had been sealed years earlier for what the zoo called budgetary reasons, but Dana had always suspected it was more than that. Her boots crunched over gravel and broken tile as she followed Officer Mallory through the unlit hallway. Her hands trembled not from fear but from something heavier, a mix of anticipation and something like dread that settled in the base of her throat. At the far end of the corridor, behind a row of rusted lockers, was the cage. It sat half swallowed in ivy vines and mildew, its frame sunken slightly into the damp concrete floor. Travis Morgan, the zookeeper, stood nearby, pale and silent, as if he had already said everything useful hours ago. The cage was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet, and clearly not meant for public view. A heavy padlock hung from the latch. It was locked through the inner loop, meaning it could only have been secured by someone on the inside. Officer Mallory removed a pair of latex gloves and reached for the bolt cutters. The metal groaned under the pressure until the padlock finally snapped, falling into the grass with a dull thud. Dana did not flinch, but her breath caught. The officers pulled the gate open slowly, letting the hinges creak with resistance. Inside was a pile of tattered cloth, possibly a blanket or an old coat, and something else scattered across the concrete floor. Scratched lines. Dozens of them. Carved into the surface with something sharp and persistent. The marks were uneven, overlapping, chaotic at first, but then more deliberate. Letters emerged, words. At the center of the floor, written in small, jagged strokes, were the words, "Lucy, age 8, still here." Donna felt her knees weaken. Officer Mallory steadied her, but she waved him off. Her eyes scanned the walls and corners. There were no bones, no remains, no smell of death, but there was something worse. A sense that the cage had once been inhabited by someone who had not wanted to be forgotten. The forensic team began their sweep, photographing each surface, taking samples from the fabric, from the walls, from the grooves in the floor. One of them called to Mallory, holding a cotton swab up with gloved fingers. A small smear of something dark maroon preserved in the shadowed back corner. Blood. Lab results would take a few days, but the team already looked somber. Dana remained silent. She walked to the edge of the cage and stared at the scratchings on the floor. Her daughter had been 5 when she vanished. 8 years old would have been 1996, 3 years after she disappeared. That number filled her with confusion. Could it mean Lucy had been alive that long after the search was abandoned? Could she have been kept here that entire time? Questions swarmed like hornets. Officer Mallory approached her later with the initial forensic report. The blood sample had enough material for a DNA match. They compared it to the sample on file from Lucy's old toothbrush. It was a match, but the blood was not 20 years old. It was much more recent, less than 5 years based on the degradation level. Dana stood still as the information settled into her bones. If the blood was Lucy's, and it was only a few years old then, that meant the unthinkable. Her daughter had not only survived past 8, she'd been alive far more recently than anyone imagined. In the following days, the zoo became the epicenter of renewed national interest. News vans returned to the gates. Old reporters unearthed their archived tapes. The local community that had long buried the memory of Lucy Bennett now whispered her name once again. The cage was removed from the zoo grounds and taken to a state crime lab for full forensic analysis. The zoo director issued a public apology which Dana found insulting and 2 decades too late. Detective Harris was brought back from retirement to consult on the case. He had been a junior officer in 1993 when Lucy vanished. Now he stood before Dana, older, slower, but sharp as ever. He reviewed the zoo blueprints and immediately noticed something odd. The cage was never listed on any official plans. It had been welded into a wall partition behind a false panel that no maintenance worker ever documented. Someone had gone to great lengths to make it disappear. Dana watched as Harris laid out photocopies on her kitchen table, showing duct roots, service tunnels, and blueprints dating back to 1985. The cage did not appear in any of them, which meant it was added later and intentionally concealed. But that raised the question, who had access and motive to build a hidden enclosure in a zoo? Harris returned to the zoo archives. Personnel files from the early 1990s were reviewed. Maintenance logs were pulled. Most of the workers from that era had moved away or passed on, but one name stood out. Gerald Vance, former head of animal behavior studies. He had resigned unexpectedly just weeks after Lucy vanished, citing family health issues. No one had heard from him in years. Dana remembered him vaguely, a quiet man with thick glasses and a permanent coffee mug in his hand. He used to lecture children at the zoo summer camp about animal instincts. He had supervised the primate wing in the early 90s. Harris dug deeper. Vance had purchased property in northern Idaho under a different name in 1995. He had filed no tax return since 2001. And his listed address was a remote house located 3 miles from the nearest road. Harris proposed a visit. Dana insisted on going with him. Harris hesitated but relented. They packed a bag each and flew out the next morning. The forest was dense and the air crisp with pine. The path to the old property was overgrown. Branches scraped the windshield as they drove. The house appeared at the top of a ridge, its roof caved in at one corner, its windows shuttered. It looked abandoned. But Donna felt something the moment she stepped out of the car, a presence not quite seen but sensed. Harris approached the porch first, calling out but receiving no answer. They stepped inside cautiously. Dust blanketed every surface. Rodents had chewed through the furniture, but on the far wall hung a photograph. Faded, torn at the edge. It showed a girl. Her hair was messy. She was barefoot. But her eyes were unmistakable. Dana stared. Her breath froze. She had not seen her daughter in 21 years, but she knew that face. It was Lucy, older. Maybe 10 or 11. But it was her, and she was standing beside Gerald Vance. The house smelled of mold and old pine, the kind of smell that settled deep into the walls and made the air feel heavier than it should. Dana stepped carefully through the collapsed doorway while Harris moved methodically ahead, sweeping the flashlight beam from corner to corner. The photograph had been enough to halt them in place when they first saw it. Lucy stood beside Gerald Vance in what looked like the woods behind the house. Her hair was longer, her clothes were oversized, and her expression was hard to read. She looked neither joyful nor scared. She looked resigned. Dana stood frozen as Harris carefully removed the photograph from the wall. The edges tore slightly, but the image remained intact. Harris slipped it into a protective sleeve. Dana did not speak. They searched the house room by room. The kitchen had rotted out. The refrigerator door hung open, revealing old cans and a single broken plate inside. The living room was full of toppled furniture and a collapsed ceiling tile. But it was the basement door that stopped them both. It stood slightly ajar. The staircase descended into darkness so complete that Harris had to hold the flashlight with both hands. Dana followed closely behind him, clutching her jacket closed. The basement was colder than the rest of the house. It was also cleaner. No fallen debris, no signs of weather or wildlife. The floor had been swept. Along one wall stood a filing cabinet streaked with rust but still locked. Harris pulled out a small metal tool from his bag and worked the mechanism until it clicked. Inside were files, dozens of them, each labeled with a different name and date. At first glance, they appeared to be behavioral logs, not of animals, but of children. Harris flipped through one labeled Subject L. It documented sleep patterns, vocabulary usage, motor coordination, and social withdrawal. Dana read over his shoulder. The handwriting was tight-controlled and formal. The entries were dated from 1994 through 1996. Each page listed Lucy's initials. There were no references to a school, no medical records. Only observational data written by someone treating a child more like a research subject than a daughter. Harris photographed every page before carefully placing them back. Then Dana noticed a small box pushed into the corner behind the cabinet. She knelt and opened it. Inside were children's drawings, crayon sketches of trees, animals, and a small house with a figure standing outside it. The figures were always the same. A little girl in red and a man in glasses standing nearby. Harris stood and dusted off his coat. He stepped away to make a call. Dana stayed behind, staring at the drawings. They felt alive. They felt like echoes. Her hand touched the paper lightly, as if it might disappear. Upstairs, Harris had found a small shelf above the fireplace. On it sat a collection of labeled VHS tapes. Most were blank except for dates and short titles. One was marked Lucy Morning Routine. Harris hesitated only a second before sliding it into his evidence bag. The next morning, Harris and Dana drove into the nearest town 20 miles from the house. They stopped at a diner to question locals. Few remembered Vance. He had kept to himself, paid in cash, grew vegetables. Some said they had seen a child with him once, but that had been years ago. An older woman who ran a thrift store remembered a girl with the tangled hair who bought a stuffed monkey with wrinkled dollar bills. Dana's voice caught when she heard that. The monkey had been Lucy's favorite animal. That night, they watched the tape. It had been degraded by age, but the images were still clear enough. It showed a girl no older than 10 sitting at a table eating cereal. The room was bare. The window behind her had no curtains. Her expression was blank. A voice off camera asked questions. The girl answered in short, quiet replies. She blinked often, as if the light hurt her eyes. When the tape ended, Dana sat in silence for several minutes. Then she asked Harris to play it again. The forensic team continued their work at the cabin. They found old medicine bottles, food wrappers, and more clothing items. None had DNA traceable to Vance. He had vanished from public records sometime around 2001. The property taxes had been paid in cash through a third party ever since. A neighbor from 3 miles down the hill was brought in for questioning. He was an older man named Lester Groves who kept to himself and lived in a trailer with 2 dogs. He admitted he had seen people at the cabin. He remembered a girl playing near the woods sometimes. She never spoke. She always looked over her shoulder. Lester said one afternoon in 1997 he had heard a scream. High-pitched, short, and sudden. He had started walking toward the sound, but a man had intercepted him on the trail. The man wore a ranger's uniform, but no badge. He said there had been a fox attack and the girl was being treated. Lester had believed him at the time. Now he was not so sure. Harris checked with the Forest Service. No rangers had been dispatched to that area in 1997. There was no fox report, no wildlife attack. The uniform had been a disguise. The man had wanted to keep Lester away from something. Dana asked for more details. Lester remembered the man's eyes. Cold, focused, like someone who was used to being obeyed. Investigators pulled old employment records and found that Gerald Vance had a twin brother named Harold Vance. He had worked briefly for a private security firm but was dismissed for aggressive conduct. No further employment history was found. Harris connected the dots slowly. Gerald may have conducted the research. Harold may have enforced it. The Vance brothers had turned that cabin into a hidden facility. Lucy had been their captive in their experiment. Harris drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set in a hard line. Dana sat beside him with the VHS tape resting in her lap, wrapped in a towel, as if it were something fragile. The drive back from the cabin was long and winding through forest roads where cell reception disappeared entirely. Neither of them spoke much until they reached the county station just after dusk. A tech met them at the evidence room and carefully took the tape to be digitized. While they waited, Harris pulled old police records and Dana reviewed every file connected to missing children in the region from 1993 to 2005. The digitized tape loaded onto the monitor in a small room with no windows. The technician pressed play. The screen came alive with static, then settled on a gray room lit by a single overhead bulb. Lucy sat on a low stool. Her arms were crossed in her lap. She wore a faded blue shirt and her knees were scraped. Her face showed no expression. The same male voice from the previous tape asked questions in a calm, even tone. "What did you dream about? What did you eat yesterday? Did you try to leave?" Her answers came after long pauses. She said she had no dreams. She had eaten rice. She had not tried to leave. Then the voice asked what she remembered about the zoo. Dana leaned forward so quickly that her chair creaked. Lucy blinked slowly and looked off to the side of the camera. She said she remembered the glass walls and the monkeys and the way it smelled like fruit and sweat. The voice asked her if she missed her mother. Her lips pressed into a line and she said nothing. The voice repeated the question. She said no in a quiet voice. The screen went black a few seconds later. Harris asked the technician to replay that last portion. Dana closed her eyes when she heard her daughter say no. She did not cry. She simply held her breath and whispered Lucy's name once under her breath. Later that night, Harris received a phone call from a women's shelter in Spokane. A counselor named Marina had been following the case on the news. She said a young woman had come in 2 years ago under a fake name and with no identification. She had burn marks on her arms and was extremely quiet. She stayed for 5 months, then left one night without telling anyone. The staff had only one photograph. Harris asked her to email it immediately. When it arrived, Dana recognized the eyes at once. The woman had dyed hair and a different nose from what she remembered, but the shape of her jaw and the tilt of her gaze were the same. Harris and Dana left the next morning for Spokane. They arrived at the shelter by noon. Marina welcomed them with a thin folder and cautious optimism. She said the woman had called herself Anna. She never gave a last name. She never asked for help beyond a bed and food. She worked in the kitchen and never made friends. But Marina said something about her always felt out of place. She had the posture of someone always watching for danger. Her sentences were short and deliberate. Her shoes were too small. Her hands were always clenched. Marina played them a recording made for intake purposes. Each new arrival was asked to say their name and answer 3 questions. The voice on the tape was soft and measured. "My name is Anna. I came from Idaho. I do not want to talk about my past." Dana listened to the voice with both hands clenched in her lap. "That is her," she said finally. "That is Lucy." Marina led them to the back hallway where Anna's room had been. The door had been painted over and given to someone else, but the contents of the room had been boxed and stored. Dana opened the box slowly. Inside were a few old clothes, a worn notebook, and a toy made of string and beads, twisted into a crude animal shape. Dana picked it up and turned it in her hands. She recognized the shape. It resembled a monkey. The notebook was filled with short entries. Most pages were blank. The entries were not dated. One page read, "I dreamed I was outside again, but the trees were wrong." Another said, "The glass was warm today and I remembered my name." Another read, "She had red hair and she sang to me through the glass." Dana closed the notebook and held it tightly. Marina told them Anna had worked part-time at a local bakery for several weeks before leaving. She gave them the address. The bakery owner remembered her, said she was quiet and never late. She had once asked to take home all the leftover flour because she wanted to learn to bake on her own. She left suddenly one afternoon and never returned. Left her apron hanging on a hook with a note that said, "Thank you." Harris visited the hospital records department and searched for patients admitted without ID in the last 10 years. A file from 4 years ago matched the pattern. A girl around 20 brought in by a man who claimed to have found her by the roadside. She had a head wound and was dehydrated. She left before being discharged. No insurance, no emergency contact. The man who brought her in gave a fake name. The hospital had a blurry surveillance still. Harris enhanced the photo and showed it to Dana. It was Lucy. They traced the man's license plate from the footage. It belonged to a rental van used only once and never returned. The van was found months later abandoned in Oregon. Inside were wrappers from a pharmacy and a single brown leather glove. Dana recognized the glove. She had seen it before in a photo from the cabin. Gerald Vance used to wear gloves like that when handling animals. The net was tightening. The trail was no longer cold. Each piece led closer to something living and real. Dana could feel her daughter's path taking shape before her, but one thing still gnawed at her. If Lucy had escaped, why had she not come home? Why had she never said her name? Why had she said no when asked if she missed her mother? The air was thick with the dust as Harris pushed open the door of the storage facility in downtown Spokane. The manager had called after running the names Gerald and Harold Vance through the news reports. A unit had been rented under an alias matching one of the brothers. The bills were paid in advance for 10 years, and the rental had begun in the summer of 2003. The key had never been used since the last payment. Dana stood outside while Harris and 2 officers rolled up the unit door. Inside, they found boxes stacked to shoulder height and a long metal cabinet that rattled slightly when touched. They opened the boxes one by one. Most contained old videotapes labeled with initials and dates. Each tape was carefully sealed in plastic sleeves and labeled in black ink. Some tapes were marked with the letters LB, others with CJ, and a few with RM. Dana watched as one officer pulled out a portable tape player and connected it to a battery. The screen flickered to life and the first tape played. A child sat on a wooden chair inside a windowless room. The child was not Lucy. It was a boy. He looked about 7 and had short dark hair. A voice from off-screen gave instructions. The boy recited numbers, then answered questions about a puzzle. They checked the next tape. Another child. This one a girl who appeared to be no more than 5. She was thinner and pale and wore a sweater too large for her frame. Her speech was monotone. The voice gave her a piece of bread and asked her to describe the taste. Dana turned away. Harris ordered the tapes collected for immediate analysis. They had stumbled onto something deeper than they expected. At the back of the unit, they found a filing cabinet bolted to the wall. Inside were documents, records, observations. But not only of Lucy. These were files of at least 6 other children with first names or initials and biological data. There were notes about behavioral responses, sleep cycles, physical growth, and resistance to isolation. One file included a log of punishments for noncompliance. Dana could not bring herself to read more than a few lines. The cabinet also held photographs. Most were Polaroids. Children standing beside cages or sitting on bare mattresses. All looked directly into the camera. None were smiling. Some had visible bruises. One photo made Dana stagger back. It showed Lucy, older, perhaps 11, standing next to a man who was not Gerald. This man had a deep scar across his left cheek and wore dark glasses. He stood with one hand on Lucy's shoulder. She did not flinch, but her eyes looked hollow. Dana asked Harris who the man was. Harris had already pulled up files on Harold Vance. But there were no known photos of him. The man in the photograph had the posture and build of someone trained in control. Harris suspected he had been the enforcer while Gerald had been the mind behind the project. Dana stared at the photo for several minutes. Then she asked to take a copy. The tapes were handed over to the state task force. Investigators reviewed each frame. They identified 3 of the children from old missing persons reports. 2 had been presumed drowned. 1 had been reported taken by a non-custodial parent. All had vanished within a span of 6 years. No bodies had ever been found. Harris contacted the families. He delivered the news with the kind of quiet honesty that only he could manage. One mother collapsed, another refused to believe. One father demanded the tapes be burned. That night, Dana returned to her motel room and sat by the window. She watched headlights pass in the parking lot and held the photograph of Lucy in her hand. Her daughter had aged, but not freely. She had grown, but without joy. Each image was a reminder that time had not stopped for her. It had twisted, warped. Dana wondered how Lucy had survived that long. She wondered how she had escaped. The following morning, Harris received another call. A man had been seen at a truck stop east of Boise with a scar across his cheek and sunglasses. He had paid in cash and driven a white panel van. The witness said the man acted nervous and looked over his shoulder constantly. He asked for directions to the state line and left in a hurry. The truck stop security camera confirmed the sighting. Harris and Dana were on a plane within hours. They landed in Boise and met with local authorities. The van had been spotted again heading toward Wyoming. Highway patrol officers were alerted. At 3 a.m., the van was found parked at a rest stop outside Rock Springs. The man inside was asleep. He matched the description. Officers approached quietly and surrounded the vehicle. When they knocked, he did not move. When they opened the door, he tried to run. He made it 30 feet before being tackled. He refused to give his name. He refused to speak. Fingerprints confirmed his identity. Harold Vance. He was taken into custody. Dana watched from behind the glass as he sat in the interrogation room with his hands cuffed and his face blank. Harris entered the room and sat down across from him. For hours, Harold said nothing. He stared at the wall and tapped his fingers in slow rhythm. Finally, Harris placed the photograph of Lucy on the table. Harold looked at it once, then turned his head. He would not speak of her. He would not speak of the tapes or the children. He said only one sentence: "They are still out there." Dana did not sleep that night. She lay awake and listened to the sounds of the hallway and the wind against the window. She thought of the children in the tapes. She thought of Lucy wandering from town to town, hiding behind fake names and silence. She thought of Harold's words and the chill that followed them. The envelope arrived at the Spokane police station 3 days after Harold Vance's arrest. It was addressed to Dana Bennett in careful block handwriting with no return address. The postmark was from Helena, Montana. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The message was written in blue ink and consisted of one sentence: "She walks the alley near Roosevelt Street on Sundays before dusk." Below the message was a sketch. It depicted a young woman with her head lowered and her hair tied in a loose braid. Her left hand held a paper bag. Her right sleeve was too long. Dana stared at the letter for several minutes before Harris asked her if she recognized the alley. She did not, but agreed to go. That Sunday, they drove into the city just after noon. Roosevelt Street ran through the industrial edge of town where warehouses and closed repair shops stood in long rows. The alley behind them was narrow and littered with broken glass and torn flyers. They parked and waited in silence. The wind picked up around 4, and by 5 the streetlights began to flicker on. Donna sat in the passenger seat with her hands gripping her coat. At 5:30 a figure appeared at the far end of the alley. She walked with a slow pace, head down, bag in hand. Dana held her breath. The woman wore a green coat with a tear near the elbow. Her shoes were mismatched. She moved like someone who expected to be stopped. Harris raised a pair of binoculars and adjusted the lens. He whispered that it was her. Dana opened the car door. Harris stopped her. He said they should wait. He said they needed to be sure. Dana shook her head. She stepped into the cold air and walked forward slowly. The woman did not notice her until they were 10 feet apart. Dana called her name once. The woman flinched. Her face lifted. Her eyes widened. For a moment she froze. Dana took one more step and said her name again. This time, the woman dropped the bag. A loaf of bread rolled out onto the pavement. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Dana reached her slowly. She did not try to hug her. She simply stood in front of her and looked into her face. The woman blinked rapidly and swayed slightly. Dana asked if she was Lucy. The woman nodded once. Harris approached and identified himself. He told her she was safe. He told her she did not have to speak now. Lucy looked at Dana again. Then she said in a quiet voice, "I waited for the door to open." They took her to the station where a counselor and a trauma specialist joined them. Lucy sat on a bench and drank warm tea from a paper cup. She did not speak much. She asked if Dana was staying. Dana said she was not leaving. Lucy nodded and stared at her hands. Over the next few days, Lucy answered questions slowly. She confirmed her identity through details no one else could know. She described the backpack she had the day she disappeared. She described the names of her toys. She described a small freckle behind her ear. She remembered the zoo. She remembered the cage. She remembered the first time the man told her that her mother had left. He said no one was coming. He said she had been given away. At first, she did not believe him. But the days turned to weeks. No one came. The lights stayed off. The doors stayed locked. And so she stopped hoping. She said Gerald had fed her twice a day. He spoke to her as if she were part of a study. He took notes. Sometimes he brought others. They watched her behind glass. They asked questions. Later, Harold came. He was different. He never asked. He gave orders. He punished disobedience. And when she turned 11, Gerald took her to the cabin. It was quieter there. Fewer people came. She was allowed to walk in the yard sometimes. She learned to chop wood. She learned to cook. Harold taught her to hide, to run, to disappear. He said the world was not safe. He said she was not normal. One night she escaped. She waited until Harold fell asleep. She took a key from his coat and walked 3 miles through the woods. A truck driver found her and drove her to a diner. She gave no name. She told them she was 18. She found work cleaning kitchens. She moved from town to town. She used different names. When she saw the news about the cage being found, she did not believe it at first. She thought it was a trap, but then she saw Dana's face on television. She watched the clip a dozen times. She started walking near Roosevelt Street, hoping someone would notice. Dana listened to every word. She did not cry. She did not interrupt. When Lucy finished, Dana said only that she was proud of her. Lucy looked down and said she did not feel brave. She said she felt broken. Dana reached for her hand and held it. Lucy did not pull away. Lucy spent her first night back under police protection in a modest apartment arranged by the department. The space was small but warm, with clean sheets and a soft lamp that glowed beside the bed. Dinah stayed in the next room, seated on the couch with a blanket across her lap. She did not sleep. She listened for movement. She listened for Lucy's breath through the thin wall, and each hour she whispered a silent thank you that her daughter was still alive. The next morning, Harris returned to the interrogation room to face Harold Vance again. This time he brought a binder filled with photographs, maps, and evidence logs. He laid each piece out on the table one by one. Harold stared at them but gave no reaction. Harris asked about the other children. He asked if any were still alive. Harold tapped his fingers slowly on the edge of the table but said nothing. Harris showed him the photograph from the storage unit, the one with Harold's hand on Lucy's shoulder. He asked again who built the cage, who designed the experiment. Harold remained silent. Then Harris placed one more item on the table, a small music box taken from the cabin. It had belonged to Lucy. It played a tune she used to hum as a toddler. When the music started, Harold's fingers stopped moving. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and spoke softly. She was never supposed to be alone. That afternoon, Dana met with Lucy's counselor. They spoke about progress and memory. Lucy had begun drawing again. Small sketches in pencil of trees, animals, and faces. The drawings were quiet and contained, but held a kind of focus that surprised the staff. She drew the cage from memory. She drew a second room with a low ceiling and a single bed. She drew a symbol that resembled a triangle inside a circle. Dana brought the symbol to Harris, who recognized it from one of the tapes. It had been stamped on a file folder inside the storage unit. Harris requested a second search of the cabin. He brought in a forensic team with the ground-penetrating radar and heat imaging. The cabin had already yielded many answers, but Harris believed something more was hidden. On the third day of scanning, a wall behind the kitchen triggered a sensor. It appeared hollow. The team removed several boards and discovered a narrow crawl space filled with dust and cobwebs. Inside, they found a wooden box sealed with rope. Dana arrived as the box was opened. Inside was a leather-bound journal marked only with the letter G. The pages were brittle, but the ink remained clear. It was a diary. It began in 1989 and ran through 2002. Gerald Vance had written every entry in precise clinical language. He described the failure of traditional primate studies. He described the theory that children in isolation would form alternate behavioral models. He called it the mirror method. The entries detailed the construction of the cage. He referred to it as the chamber. He described Lucy's intake, her reactions, her silence, her eventual adaptation. He spoke of others. Subject B was a boy with auditory sensitivity. Subject M was a girl with chronic sleep paralysis. He noted reactions to fear, hunger, solitude, and sound. He referred to Harold as the stabilizer. His role was to maintain obedience. One entry stood out. Dated March 1996. Gerald wrote that Subject L began speaking to someone not present. She referred to a figure in the corner. She claimed he watched her sleep. Gerald dismissed it as stress hallucination, but noted that it persisted. Another entry a month later mentioned that Subject L had begun carving symbols into the wall, the same triangle and circle. Gerald considered terminating the study, but Harold refused. He said she was beginning to see. Harris read every page and marked the names. He cross-referenced them with missing persons reports. At least 3 names matched. One boy had vanished from Portland in 1994, another from Reno in 1995. The girl had disappeared from a church camp in Montana. None had been found. Dana took the journal to Lucy. She asked if she remembered the symbols. Lucy nodded slowly. She said she had seen them drawn by others. She said they marked the hidden rooms. She said there had been a place Harold called the Retreat, a property in the mountains. Remote, cold, quiet. She did not know where, but she remembered the scent of pine and the sound of water. She remembered snow on the windows and the hum of an old generator. Harris requested satellite scans of the mountain ranges surrounding the area. He asked the Forest Service for access to abandoned cabins. He checked land registry databases for parcels purchased in cash between 1990 and 2000. After 4 days, they found one. A property listed under a shell company dissolved in 2003. It sat near the base of a mountain pass and had no visible road access, only a footpath through the trees. A helicopter was arranged. Dana asked to come, but was denied. She waited at the station with Lucy. Harris and the team landed near the property just after dawn. The house was small, with boarded windows and a chimney of stone. The roof was intact. The door was locked. They breached it. Inside was silence. No sign of recent life. But in the back room they found beds. 4 of them. Each made. Each labeled with initials. BMCL. Each bed had a small pile of books and a drawing. There was a trapdoor beneath a rug. It led to a basement. Inside were shelves of supplies. Food, water, medical kits, and something else. A small room with padded walls, a projector, dozens of labeled reels. Harris opened one and held it to the light. It showed a child in profile. Reading, rocking, silent. The reels from the mountain cabin were transferred to a digital lab where technicians began the process of restoring and analyzing each frame. Some of the film had warped from time and cold, but most of it remained intact. Harris sat with headphones on as the first recordings were processed. The children appeared in small soundproof rooms under dim lighting. They sat for hours in silence. Occasionally, a voice prompted them to repeat phrases or perform tasks. Each session was labeled with date and subject initials. Dana watched the footage of Lucy from a distance. Her daughter's eyes were dull. She blinked slowly. She did as she was told. She never smiled. The voice on the recording was male, calm, measured. Gerald's voice. He narrated observations like a lecturer. He noted when Lucy avoided eye contact. He noted when she stared into the corners of the room. He noted that she never cried. Dana clenched her fists and turned away. One of the reels contained something unexpected. A recording of a session marked Subject C. A boy sat cross-legged on the floor and hummed quietly to himself. The voice asked him about dreams. The boy answered in a soft voice. He said he dreamed of a door that only opened when no one looked at it. He said the door had a number on it. 34. The voice asked if he tried to open it. The boy said he was not allowed. The voice asked who said so. The boy answered her. The girl in the glass. Technicians slowed the tape and enhanced the audio. The boy's tone changed. He sounded afraid. He said she watched him at night. He said her face changed when the lights turned off. He said she told him he would forget his name. Dana listened to the tape with growing unease. Harris noted that the voice of the boy did not match any known missing child. No file referenced Subject C. It was as if he had been erased. They discovered one more reel labeled Final Review. It featured no children, only audio. Gerald's voice filled the room with slow, deliberate cadence. He spoke of the mirror method. He said the goal was not to break them, but to erase the conditions that created the person before. He said memory was not necessary for survival. He said structure and routine were enough. He ended the tape with one sentence. The chain must never break. Harris and Donna examined the floor plans of the cabin again. The layout suggested another room unaccounted for, a narrow gap between the outer wall and the storage basement. They returned to the site with ground radar. The scan revealed a sealed compartment behind the north foundation. It had no door. The team used drills and extracted a square panel of wood. Behind it was a chamber filled with crates and a small desk. Inside the desk was a tape recorder and several cassettes labeled only with dates. The earliest tape began with static, then breathing, then Gerald's voice. He said the date and then read notes about Subject L. He spoke of resistance. He said she still spoke to the others. He said she had drawn the symbol again. He said she asked about her mother. The next tape revealed something worse. Gerald said Subject L had attempted to escape. She had manipulated a hinge with a spoon. She had made it to the outer yard. Harold retrieved her. Gerald said punishment was administered. He said she did not speak for 3 days afterward. Donna listened in stunned silence. Lucy had never told her this. They found one more cassette. It was labeled only with the letter R. The tape began with static and then a voice neither Gerald's nor Harold's. A woman's voice. She whispered phrases. The words were difficult to hear. She said the mirror was cracking. She said, "They see when you forget." She said, "Silence is not empty." Dana asked the technician to play it again. The voice did not match any staff records. It was unknown. Later that week, Lucy agreed to return to the cabin. She said she wanted to see if it felt real. Dana and Harris accompanied her. She walked the hallways slowly. She touched the walls. She stopped by the rooms where the other beds had been. She pointed to one corner and said, "That is where I sat when they played the music." She pointed to the shelf and said, "That is where they kept the blue books." She asked to see the storage basement. The team led her carefully. She looked at the padded room and nodded. She walked to the far wall and ran her hand across the surface. Then she said, "The wall is thinner here." Harris stepped closer. He tapped the area. It echoed slightly. They brought tools and began removing boards. Behind them was a passage only 2 feet wide. Lucy said, "I remember crawling through here once. I thought it was a dream." They followed her. The passage led to a second chamber. It was circular. The walls were covered in etchings. Symbols, words, faces. It looked like the inside of a well. Lucy stepped inside and turned slowly. She pointed to a phrase carved above the entrance. It said, "I am still her." The word "her" was spelled without the final E. Lucy stared at it for a long time. She said, "I did not write that." The carvings on the walls extended in every direction. They wrapped around the chamber in tight spirals and broken lines. Some were scratched deep into the surface. Others were faint, as if etched by trembling fingers. Lucy moved slowly around the perimeter, trailing her hand along the uneven stone. Dana stood at the entrance, afraid to interrupt. Harris kept his flashlight steady as he photographed every symbol and word. One section contained what appeared to be a sequence of names. They were fragmented and overlapped each other. Some were just initials. Others were full names that had been crossed out and replaced with different ones. Lucy pointed to one that read Claire, then underneath it a second name, Rona. She whispered that she remembered a girl with short hair who never spoke. She said the others called her Claire, but one day Gerald began calling her Rona instead. Lucy said she never corrected him. On the opposite wall were numbers. They formed no clear pattern at first, but Harris noticed that several repeated in sequences. One set appeared again and again. 347. It was carved into the stone above what looked like a small hatch in the floor. The hatch was bolted shut with old screws. Lucy said she had never seen it before. The team removed the bolts and lifted the hatch. A metal ladder led downward into a narrow shaft that descended into darkness. Harris descended first. The space below was low-ceilinged and smelled of damp metal. At the bottom was a door. It was steel and painted black. A faded sticker peeled from the surface. It said maintenance. Harris pushed the door open slowly. The room beyond was lined with shelves. Each shelf held rows of binders and boxes labeled with dates. A single desk sat in the corner with a rotary phone mounted to the wall above it. The air was cold and still. Dana joined him moments later. Lucy stayed above until Harris confirmed it was safe. They opened one of the boxes. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Each photograph showed a child standing in front of a blank wall. Each child held a sign with their initials and a number. Some children looked confused. Others looked resigned. One image showed a boy holding a paper that read CJ008. Dana held the photo and whispered that it looked like the boy from the tape who had spoken of the door. The binders contained session notes and charts. Many were written in a language that appeared coded. Harris identified a pattern in the symbols, a mix of shorthand and substitution. He called in a specialist to begin the decoding process. One sheet contained a list of locations with corresponding dates. Each location was in a different state. One matched the zoo where Lucy vanished. Another matched the church camp from a previous case. A third was unfamiliar to Donna or Harris. It simply said June 1999. Oakwell. Lucy's eyes widened at the name. She said Oakwell was a place Gerald once mentioned when he was angry. She said he called it the failed site. Further inside the room, they found a small monitor mounted to the ceiling. It was connected to a network of wires that disappeared into the wall. The screen flickered as Harris powered it on. A blue image appeared. It showed a hallway. The footage was live. The hallway had white walls and numbered doors. Room 5 was open. A figure walked past. The figure was a child. Dana gasped. Lucy stepped closer and stared. She said she did not recognize the hallway, but the doors were the same. Harris immediately traced the signal using a portable locator. The transmission was weak and scrambled. The team outside adjusted the satellite link and pinpointed a direction. The coordinates led to a stretch of forest 60 miles east. There were no registered buildings in the area. The team mobilized at dawn. Dana insisted on joining them. Harris allowed it under strict conditions. Lucy remained at the base camp under protection. The helicopter landed in a clearing surrounded by pine trees and mist. The team moved quickly through the brush using the coordinates as a guide. After 2 hours, they found a camouflaged structure nestled between rock outcrops. It had no windows. The door was steel and locked from the outside. They breached the door using thermal tools. The hallway inside matched the footage. White walls, numbered doors. Room 5 stood open. Inside was a bed, a chair, a notebook, no child, but the room was warm, recently used. Harris called out. A small voice responded. They followed it to room 7. A boy stood inside. He wore a gray shirt and no shoes. His eyes were wide, but he did not run. Harris knelt and introduced himself. The boy said his name was Connor. He said he had been there for a long time. Dana held her breath. The boy asked if the lights were broken. He said the lights always turned off at night. He said the girl in the wall had not spoken today. They found 2 more children. One in room 2, one in room 6, all under 12. All malnourished but responsive. Each child had a bed and a notebook. Each notebook contained drawings. The same symbol appeared again and again. The triangle inside the circle. Harris moved quickly. The team escorted the children outside. Paramedics met them halfway down the trail. Dana walked beside the boy named Connor and kept her voice soft. Back at the base camp, Lucy waited. She saw the children arrive. Her face shifted. She approached slowly. Connor looked up and froze. Then he said, "You are her." Lucy asked who he meant. Connor said, "The girl in the glass." Lucy dropped to her knees. She said, "I was like you." Connor nodded. He said, "You told me to stay quiet when it got loud." Lucy whispered that she had dreamed of this moment. The facility was cleared by federal agents by nightfall. Each hallway was photographed, each room was documented, each piece of equipment cataloged for analysis. The 3 children were transported to a medical center where they received food, clothing, and immediate care. Dana stayed by Lucy's side as the news spread. Cameras were kept at a distance and the public was told only that a significant development had occurred. Harris coordinated with interagency teams to ensure the location would remain undisturbed until every trace was understood. Lucy sat in a quiet room with Connor, the boy from room 7. She spoke softly as he ate toast and looked out the window. He asked again about the girl in the glass, and Lucy explained in careful words that sometimes memories feel like dreams, and sometimes dreams are the only way our mind lets us remember. Connor nodded and said the girl had said he would not be alone. Lucy reached over and touched his shoulder. "You are not alone now," she said. Her voice remained calm, but her eyes were filled with something deeper than relief. It was understanding. The following morning, Harris returned to the underground chamber beneath the original cabin. The decoding team had made progress with the cipher found in the binders. They now believed it was based on modified scientific notation combined with the basic transposition key. When translated, one sheet revealed a list of dates and conditions followed by the phrase, "pattern disruption in subject L." Gerald had believed Lucy was unique not because she adapted, but because she resisted. She never lost her name. She never forgot her mother. He had not seen that as love. He had seen it as a contamination of control. Dana read the page with trembling hands. She remembered every night she'd spoken Lucy's name aloud, even when she was alone, even when people said to let go. She believed that something held those words in the air. That belief had crossed time and distance and darkness. Lucy had heard it. Somewhere inside the glass, she had heard it. At the hospital, Connor gave the doctors another piece of the story. He said there had been another room, a round one with lights that flickered blue. He said the others called it the end room. He said they were taken there when they stopped following the rules. Lucy closed her eyes when she heard that. She said she remembered the room. She said the lights were not blue. They were white, but everything else felt true. Harris returned to the Oakwell site with a new team. They scanned every wall, every floor tile, every corner. They found a pressure differential beneath the far corridor. It led to a concealed door with no handle. They used ground drills to breach it. Behind the wall was the end room. The room was round with smooth surfaces and no markings. In the center stood a single chair. The walls were soundproofed. A control panel lined one side connected to a bank of monitors. The room had no windows. Harris stepped inside and listened. The silence pressed against his ears. It felt like standing inside a heartbeat. They found a small drawer beneath the panel. Inside were 6 name tags. Each tag had initials and a number. One read LB003. Dana held it and whispered that it had been on Lucy's jacket. Another tag read CJ008. Another read CN011. Connor's number, the last tag, was blank. Dana placed it gently back in the drawer. As the agents packed up the equipment, Harris found one last item, a small cassette tape labeled with only the letter L. He handed it to the technician who played it on a portable deck. The room filled with static, then a child's voice. It was Lucy. She spoke slowly and carefully. She said, "I know my name. I remember the zoo. I remember the light. I remember the smell of oranges. I remember her voice." The tape ended with her saying, "I am not gone." Dana stood still. The world felt paused around her. Lucy reached for the player and asked to hear it again. They played it once more. Her voice from years ago carried through the speaker like a whisper from behind the wall. Lucy said she remembered speaking into the microphone, but had not known if anyone heard her. She said she hoped someone did. The tape became evidence. But to Dana, it was something more. It was a message across time, a signal that her daughter had never truly disappeared. She had always been reaching. Dana asked Lucy if she wanted to keep the tape. Lucy said no. She said someone else might need to hear it. She asked if it could be played for the other children. Dana nodded. The following week, a gathering was held in a private room at the hospital. Lucy stood beside Connor and the other 2 children. Donna and Harris sat nearby. The tape played once. The children listened. One girl covered her mouth. The boy from room 2 nodded slowly. Lucy said, "This voice helped me when I thought I was gone. Maybe it will help you too." The agents continued their search for more locations, but no others were found. Harold remained in custody, refusing to speak. Gerald was declared legally deceased based on the journal entries and the lack of any recent evidence. The files were sealed, but the names of the children were protected. A foundation was created for their care. Dana helped organize the first support group. Months passed. Lucy enrolled in an art class. She began to draw faces with smiles. She painted trees that stretched beyond the canvas. She wrote stories about light breaking through glass. Dana framed each one and placed them on her wall. Harris visited often. He no longer asked questions. He simply brought coffee and sat with them as the sun moved across the window. One afternoon, Lucy walked alone through the zoo. It had reopened part of its grounds and the primate wing had been replaced with a garden. She stood near the spot where the cage had once been. She looked at the sky. She closed her eyes. She whispered her name. She turned and saw a child watching the monkeys. The child looked over and smiled. Lucy smiled back. She did not need to speak. She walked away slowly and felt the wind touch her face. She thought of the mirror method. She thought of how Gerald tried to erase what made her human, but he had failed. Because she had remembered. She had remembered love. She had remembered her mother's voice. She had remembered the smell of oranges. She had remembered her name. Thanks for watching this story unfold. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe for more mysterious and emotional journeys. Share your thoughts about the plot in the comments and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We read every one.